On March 3rd, 2025, Nashville woke to a silence it had never known before. The voice that once healed millions, the woman who turned pain into poetry, was facing her hardest song yet. Dolly Parton, the queen of country and the heartbeat of American soul, had just lost the love of her life. After nearly 60 years together, her husband Carl Dean passed away, leaving behind an empty chair, a cold cup of coffee, and a house filled with memories too sacred to touch. For decades, she gave the world everything. More than 100 million records sold, thousands of songs written, and a lifetime of hope wrapped in melody. But when the lights went dark and the applause faded, what remained was not a legend, but a woman sitting alone at dawn, whispering to the silence beside her. This is not just a story about music. It is a story about love that outlasts time, about loss that teaches us grace, and about the strength it takes to keep singing when your heart is breaking. If you are ready to feel the story behind the legend, subscribe to the channel. And if you are still here right now, listening to her heartbeat through the quiet, write the number 1 in the comments, because tonight the song continues, softer but eternal. It was March 3rd, 2025, when Nashville woke to silence. The man who had stood quietly behind one of the world's most famous voices was gone. Carl Dean, husband of Dolly Parton for nearly 60 years, passed away at the age of 82 in their home on the edge of Brentwood. The woman who had filled every corner of America with her laughter now sat before 2 cups of coffee. One steamed gently, the other would never be touched again. For almost 6 decades, he had been her stillness, while she traveled the world, sold more than 100 million records, and became the shining symbol of country music. Carl stayed home, mowing their lawn, fixing the fence, waiting for her to come back to the quiet. He never cared for fame, he only cared for her. That morning, the house felt hollow. His boots stood by the door. His favorite newspaper lay folded on the armchair. The garden he had planted with his own hands was blooming, as if refusing to understand what had changed. 3 days later, in the small chapel they built on their land, family and close friends gathered. No cameras, no audience, just the sound of wooden pews and soft breathing. Dolly stepped forward with her old guitar. The same hands that had written thousands of songs trembled. Her voice broke on the first note. For a moment, the woman who had turned the sorrow into hope for millions could only whisper her farewell. The crowd did not clap. They simply listened. And in that quiet, the Queen of Country sang not to the world, but to the one man who had always loved her without a stage. Before the lights, before the fame, before that quiet morning when she sat alone with 2 cups of coffee, there was another world, a world made of wind, wood, and willpower. To understand the woman the world calls a legend, we have to return to where the song first began. It was January 19th, 1946, in the hills of Sevier County, Tennessee. The air was so cold it cracked, and the stars above the Smoky Mountains burned like tiny fires refusing to die. Inside a one-room cabin, a young mother labored by the dim flicker of an oil lamp, while snow pressed hard against the walls. That night, a child was born into the dark. Her name was Dolly Rebecca Parton. The doctor was paid with a sack of cornmeal because her parents, Robert Lee and Avie Lee, had nothing else to give. The cabin crouched between ridges, no bigger than a modern garage, no electricity, no plumbing, no running water. When the wind howled, it came straight through the cracks and kissed the children's faces as they slept. In winter, 12 of them shared one blanket, curling close to each other while frost crept along the window panes. Poverty didn't visit the Partons. It lived with them, constant as breath. Her father, Robert, was a man of silence and grit. He worked sunrise to dusk hauling gravel and tending the fields, his hands split open by cold and work. He could not read, but he could pray through action, and every blister on his palm was a verse of love. Her mother, Avie Lee, was the heart that kept that house alive. She sang while she cooked, hummed while she mended, her voice trembling, but kind. She taught her children that even in the darkest night, faith was its own kind of fire. When Dolly was 6, she became the family's helper, fetching water from the creek so cold it bit her fingers raw, rocking babies to sleep, stirring beans over a smoky stove. Her toys were corn cobs and imagination. She made dolls from cloth scraps, giving each one a name and a story. Then came the winter of 1955. Dolly was 9 when her baby brother Larry was born. 4 days later, he was gone. The family buried him behind the house with no stone, no ceremony, only quiet. Her mother's eyes went hollow, her father's shoulders heavier, and the little girl who sang to fill the silence learned that some songs would never have words. 1 year later, her mother stitched her a coat from leftover rags. Each patch carried love, but at school the children laughed. She walked home through the snow, tears freezing on her cheeks, whispering that one day, the world would see the beauty she saw. That promise became a song, coat of many colors, an anthem of pride and pain stitched together in melody. By 7, she was already writing songs, her voice carrying through the hollows like smoke rising from a wood fire. Soft but steady, she wasn't singing to be heard. She was singing to survive. And in that cabin, surrounded by hunger, hope, and the hum of her mother's lullabies, a legend began to breathe. Before the world called her a legend, she was just a girl stepping off a Greyhound bus with a cardboard suitcase and a dream. The year was 1960, and Nashville shimmered ahead of her like a promise wrapped in smoke. Dolly Rebecca Parton was 18 years old, wearing a handmade dress, clutching $20 in her pocket and a song in her heart. She looked at the skyline and whispered to herself that she would make it, or she would never come back. The city smelled of rain, oil, and ambition. The streets hummed with guitars, voices, and deals whispered behind studio doors. For every dream that rose from the honky-tonks, 10 more died in the alleys behind them. To most people, she was another mountain girl with big hair and bigger hopes. But there was something fierce in her, something that had survived hunger, cold, and humiliation. She had not come to fit in. She had come to be heard. Her first nights in Nashville were lonelier than the mountain winters she had escaped. The room she rented by the week was barely large enough for a bed and a cracked mirror. When it rained, the ceiling leaked, and the neon light from a diner sign blinked through her window like a broken heartbeat. She wrote songs on scraps of paper, on grocery bags, even on the cardboard of old cigarette packs. When the money ran out, she would skip meals and sing softly to herself, letting hunger find its rhythm in melody. Nashville in the 1960s was a man's world. Studio producers wanted women to sound sweet and look smaller. They told her that her voice was too sharp, too country, too real. One of them laughed and said her accent would never sell a record. She smiled, nodded politely, and then sang anyway. They wanted sugar. She gave them soul. In 1965, her persistence earned her a contract with Monument Records. For most young singers, that would have been the dream. For Dolly, it was another test. They dressed her in glitter, gave her soft pop songs, and told her to smile wider. Her voice was captured perfectly, but the songs weren't hers. Each recording session felt like wearing someone else's skin. Her singles flopped, one after another. The phone stopped ringing. But every night when the city slept, she wrote. She filled notebooks with lyrics, words that belonged to her alone. Then in 1906, a miracle found her. A song she co-wrote with her uncle Bill Owens, titled "Put It Off Until Tomorrow," became a #1 hit for singer Bill Phillips. Suddenly, people began to ask who the young songwriter behind that melody was. Doors that had been locked for years began to open a crack. The next year, she released her debut album, Hello, I'm Dolly. It wasn't just an introduction. It was a declaration. The songs weren't polished lies. They were stitched together from memory, sweat, and prayer. When she sang, her voice cut through the polished air of Nashville like thunder rolling down from the mountains. By the time the last note faded, the city knew it was hearing something it couldn't manufacture. Her life didn't change overnight. She still rode buses to small shows, shared cheap meals with other dreamers, and wore dresses she sewed by hand. But her songs began to travel faster than she could. Each lyric carried the weight of her past, and each performance glowed with the strength of someone who had learned how to survive with nothing but a voice. By 1969, she had written hundreds of songs, many recorded by other artists, each one a stepping stone out of poverty and into history. She was the living proof that you could rise without forgetting the ground beneath you. Every melody she wrote still smelled of wood smoke and Tennessee rain. She often said that her voice came from the mountains, that even when she sang for the world, she could still hear the wind between the ridges. The girl who once sang to stay warm was now warming the hearts of millions. Her music was no longer just sound, it was defiance. It was the proof that a little girl born in a one-room cabin could stand in the capital of country music and make the whole world listen. The lights of Nashville had finally turned toward her, but they didn't know that the light shining brightest came from her. By the early 1970s, the girl from the Smoky Mountains had become a star that Nashville could no longer ignore. Her songs were everywhere, her smile, her voice, her laughter. They all felt larger than the stage itself. Millions tuned in every week to see her on the Porter Wagoner Show, a partnership that carried her name into living rooms across America. But behind the glitter and the harmony, there was a storm quietly growing. Porter Wagoner had been her mentor, her partner, and the man who helped open every door that led to her success. Together, they toured the country, recording, performing, appearing on television. Their chemistry on stage was undeniable. Two voices braided together by faith and ambition. But what had begun as friendship and creative fire turned into tension and control. Porter wanted to keep her beside him, but Dolly had her own songs waiting to be sung. By 1973, she knew she had to leave. The price of staying was her freedom, and freedom was the only thing she had ever truly owned. She walked into his office one morning, tears already gathering, and told him she was going. Later that night, she went home, sat down with her guitar, and poured her heart into a song. The next day, she returned and sang it for him. It was "I Will Always Love You." It was not anger, not bitterness, only a farewell filled with gratitude. That song would one day sell over 20 million copies and travel around the world, carrying her voice into every corner of music history. The same year, she released Jolene, a song so simple it could fit on a napkin, yet so powerful it could stop a room. Its haunting plea was not vengeance, but vulnerability. It proved that strength did not always need to shout. Decades later, Jolene would be covered by hundreds of artists, from country singers to pop icons, each one echoing the truth that heartbreak, when sung honestly, belongs to everyone. Success wrapped itself around her like a crown of fire. The tours became longer, the interviews endless. Some weeks she performed 6 shows in 5 different cities, sleeping only a few hours between flights. The dresses she wore on stage weighed as much as a child, each one covered in thousands of sequins that sparkled like tiny suns. Under the lights, they looked like magic, but beneath them, her skin burned from heat and glue. She learned to laugh through exhaustion, to smile through pain, to sparkle even when her body begged for rest. By the end of the decade, her fame was unstoppable. She had crossed from country to pop, from small-town dreamer to international star. But behind the applause, her body began to crumble. The doctors called it endometriosis, a cruel condition that filled her days with pain and took from her the chance to become a mother. In 1982, at 36 years old, she underwent surgery that changed her life forever. When she woke in the hospital, she stared at the ceiling, her hands resting on her stomach, realizing the silence in that room would never leave her. For the first time, the woman who had written songs for every kind of heartbreak faced one that could not be healed by melody. She stopped writing. She stopped singing. She drifted through her days like a ghost in glitter. Friends said they could see the light fading from her eyes. She was alive, but she was not living. Then one night, when the world seemed to have gone dark, a small dog named Popeye jumped into her lap. He looked up at her with the kind of love that asks for nothing. That simple moment pulled her back. Later, she said that tiny heartbeat had saved her life. And in the stillness of that night, Dolly Parton began to rise again. When she returned to the studio, the world noticed. In 1910, Here You Come Again soared to #1 on the country chart and reached #3 on the pop chart. Critics called it a revolution. Purists accused her of betrayal. She smiled and said softly that she was not leaving country. She was taking it with her. The statement was not rebellion, it was truth. From that moment, Dolly Parton was no longer just a country singer. She was a survivor, a force of light that refused to fade. Every song, every laugh, every dazzling costume was built from the same thing she had carried since childhood: endurance. She had learned that beauty was not the absence of struggle, but the courage to shine through it. By the time the 1980s began, her music had crossed oceans and generations. She stood at the summit of her art, but she never forgot the dirt road that led there. Every rhinestone on her dress was a scar turned into light, every lyric a memory rewritten in melody. When people looked at her, they saw glamour. But when they listened, they heard something deeper. They heard a woman who had survived the weight of her own brilliance and turned pain into grace. That was the price of the light, and she paid it, every single day, with a smile that hid the fire beneath. It was the spring of 1984, and for the first time in 20 years, Dolly Parton stood still. The whirlwind of fame had slowed. The flashing lights faded into something softer. But stillness has its own kind of storm. Behind every success, there were ghosts waiting to be heard. The next decades of her life would not be defined by applause, but by loss, love, and the quiet strength that lives inside grief. Her mother, Avi Lee, had always been her first harmony, the woman who taught her that faith could warm a house better than fire, who sang lullabies over boiling pots and prayed through every hardship. When Avi Lee fell ill in the early 2000s, Dolly visited the old home in Sevier County and sat beside her bed. They talked about music, about heaven, about the coat made of scraps that once kept 12 children alive through the coldest winters. On December 5th, 2003, Avi Lee Parton passed away. The world didn't hear about it until weeks later. Dolly kept the grief to herself. She tried to sing Coat of Many Colors at her next show, but the words caught in her throat. It was more than a song now. It was a memory stitched with love and absence. She told friends that when her mother died, a part of her voice went with her. Her brother Floyd had always been the quiet one, her shadow in the studio, the songwriter who didn't chase fame but built it for others. They wrote dozens of songs together, including Rockin' Years, which reached #1 in 1991. Floyd understood her in a way no one else could. When he died suddenly in December 2018 at 61, the news barely made the papers. But to Dolly, it felt like the mountains of her childhood had shifted. At his funeral, held in a small chapel surrounded by the Tennessee hills, she sang softly without a microphone. Her hands trembled as she strummed his old guitar. Those who were there said her voice cracked in the middle of the chorus, and she didn't try to fix it. The silence that followed was its own song, raw and holy. She said later that night that losing Floyd was like losing the map that led her home. Then came the loss that broke something deeper. Her niece, Tever, only 36, a bright, tender soul who had grown up in Dolly's shadow but never asked for the light. The world didn't know her, but Dolly did. She had watched the young woman struggle through pain, heartbreak, and addiction. When things got worse, Dolly paid for her rehab herself, $25,000 out of her own pocket, hoping to buy her another chance. But money can't cure sorrow, and faith can't always rewrite fate. Tever's heart gave out before her hope could come back. The news came quietly, no headlines, just a phone call and a silence that stretched across the house like fog. Friends said Dolly sat for hours without speaking, just holding a folded handkerchief and whispering her niece's name. There was no public funeral, no stage, no speeches. Just family, prayer, and the kind of heartbreak too private for cameras. She said later that some songs aren't meant to be sung. They live inside you, heavy as stone, teaching you the boost of love. And yet, from that pain, she built something beautiful. In 1990, long before these losses, she had already started giving her love to the world in another way. She founded the Imagination Library, a program that mailed free books to children every month from birth to age 5. What began as a local dream in her hometown grew into a global miracle. By 2020, the program had given away more than 200 million books across 5 continents. For the woman who could never have children, it became her way of mothering the world. Dolly once said that if she couldn't have her own child, she would help raise everyone else's. And she meant it. Her name reached places she would never visit, her stories landing in small mailboxes in small towns where children might never know who sent them. That was her kind of love, quiet but endless. Even in grief, she worked. She recorded albums, appeared on stage, smiled for cameras, but her eyes often carried a softness that told another story. Between the spotlights and the laughter, there was always a pause, a moment of faraway silence, as if she were listening for the voices she had lost. In one interview, when asked how she endured so much loss, she smiled and said that love and pain were the same fabric, just stitched on different sides. That when you love deep, you hurt deep, but you keep loving anyway. By her late 70s, Dolly's life had become a patchwork of miracles and mourning. Her mother's hands, her brother's laughter, her niece's smile, they all lived into her songs, even when she never named them. The world saw a woman of glitter and laughter, but those who listened closely heard the echo beneath it, a quiet choir made of memory, and that became her truest music. Not the hits or the trophies or the fame, but the way she turned sorrow into kindness. She carried her pain the way her mother carried that patchwork coat stitched together from pieces of loss, worn with pride and glowing with grace. Some singers chase applause. Dolly sang to keep the silence company, and through every death, every heartbreak, every goodbye, she proved again what she had known since childhood, that even when love breaks you, it also builds you. Because every loss, in her hands, became a song without words. It was March 3rd, 2025, when the world turned its eyes toward Nashville once again. The morning broke soft and gray, but the silence felt heavier than any storm. News spread slowly at first, whispered across radios and screens, carried by fans who could hardly believe it. Carl Dean, the man who had quietly stood beside Dolly Parton for nearly 60 years, had passed away at the age of 82. For the world, Carl was a mystery. For her, he was home, in a life built on stages, lights, and applause. He had been the stillness behind the curtain, the quiet heartbeat that never needed to be seen. When he was gone, the house they shared in Brentwood seemed to exhale all at once. The laughter that once echoed through its halls was replaced by a silence that had weight. Friends said she barely spoke in those first days. The phone rang and went unanswered. Meals went cold on the table. His boots stayed by the door, his newspaper still folded on the armchair. 2 coffee cups side by side on the kitchen counter. She could not bring herself to move them. 3 days later, in a small cedar chapel on their land, she said goodbye. There were no cameras, no stage lights, no red carpets, just family, a few close friends, and the hum of quiet sorrow. Dolly walked down the aisle in a simple black dress, her famous hair undone, her hands trembling as she carried the gaiter Carl had bought her before her first hit. She sang softly, barely above a whisper, her voice cracking on every note. Those who were there said it was the most human sound they had ever heard. It was not a performance, or it was love saying farewell. After the service, she disappeared from the public eye. The world waited for her next appearance, but none came. Her sister Frida wrote online that Dolly had not been feeling well and asked fans everywhere to pray. Within hours, millions responded. Across continents, people lit candles, shared her songs, and whispered her name in prayer. For a woman who had carried the world through its pain, the world now carried her. Doctors told her to rest, But rest was something she never learned. For nearly 6 decades, she had lived in motion. 3,000 songs written, 100 million records sold, 11 Grammy Awards, 200 million books gifted to children through her imagination library. Every hour of her life had been spent giving something to someone. Now, for the first time, she was being asked to stop. She tried. Mornings found her sitting by the kitchen window, the light of Tennessee spilling through lace curtains. She still brewed 2 cups of coffee out of habit. One sat untouched, steaming gently beside her own. She talked softly into the quiet, telling him about the sunrise, about the birds, about how the magnolias were blooming too early this year. When the words ran out, she would walk to the chapel where his picture rested near the altar and sit on the first pew, her hands folded, her eyes closed. There she would hum the songs that no one would ever hear, little melodies without names, half prayers, half memories. Sometimes she laughed at an old joke only he would have understood. Other times her eyes filled until the lines on her cheeks shone. A friend once said that Dolly never really learned how to let go. She just learned how to love in silence. Months passed. Her strength returned slowly, but her steps grew smaller, her voice softer. She looked like a woman carved from light and memory. Still, her spirit glowed, even in grief. She found her way back to music. Late that summer, she began writing again, filling pages with words about time, faith, and love that never dies. One line she wrote became a kind of prayer for herself. Love doesn't die, it just changes its address. By the end of 2025, she was recording again in her private studio. The songs were quieter now, tender and trembling, but the truth inside them was brighter than ever. Friends who heard them said they sounded like hymns, each one written from the space between loss and grace. Her health was fragile, her energy limited, but her humor never faded. When asked how she was feeling, she smiled and said that the Lord had carried her through worse. It wasn't pride, it was faith. The same faith that had kept her alive through every season of loss. Letters continued to pour in, thousands each week. Fans thanked her for the songs that had saved them. One woman wrote that her music had helped her survive the death of her own husband. Dolly read the letter twice, pressed it to her heart, and whispered, "Me too." Now, at 79, she walks a little slower through the house they built together. The walls shimmer with gold records, but she says the real treasures are the photographs. The two of them in the garden, barefoot on the porch, laughing at nothing and everything. At night, she still sits in the old rocking chair beneath the same stars that once shone over her childhood cabin. The wind moves through the trees, and sometimes she swears she hears his voice in it, soft and steady, calling her home. For nearly 8 decades, Dolly Parton has turned pain into poetry, sorrow into song, and love into legacy. She taught the world that kindness is a kind of strength, that grace is louder than grief, and that true beauty lives not in perfection, but in persistence. She once said she wasn't afraid of dying, only of leaving songs unfinished. And maybe that is the truest part of her story, that even now, as her body bends with time and her voice carries the tremor of age, her heart still sings, because love, once given freely, never disappears. It just changes its key, rising softly into eternity, where the music never ends. When we look back at the life of Dolly Parton, we see more than the sparkle of rhinestones or the glow of fame. We see a woman who turned pain into purpose and sorrow into song. Behind every smile, every laugh, and every glittering stage light was a story of faith, endurance, and love that never gave up. Her life reminds us that the most powerful voices do not come from comfort, but from courage. From the misty hills of Tennessee to the grandest stages on earth, Dolly carried the same truth wherever she went. You do not have to be born into greatness to live a great life. You only have to keep believing when no one else does. She showed us that kindness is not a weakness, that humility is a kind of strength, and that every hardship can be rewritten into hope if you are brave enough to sing through it. When the world told her she was too small, too simple, too country, She smiled and kept going. When she lost her health, she turned to faith. When she lost the people she loved most, she carried them in her heart and let their memory live through melody. Even now, as time softens her step and slows her breath, her spirit still burns bright, not because life was kind, but because she chose to meet it with grace. Her story teaches us that success is not about trophies or money. It is about the love we give, the strength we build, and the peace we leave behind. It is about standing tall when the world tries to bend you, about finding light in the darkest nights, and about forgiving when it would be easier to hate. Dolly proved that real beauty comes from resilience, and that true greatness is simply refusing to stop loving, even when it hurts. So as this story comes to an end, let it stay with you. Let it remind you to be kind, to keep creating, and to never stop believing in your own song. Maybe her journey will inspire you to chase your dreams with the same fire. Or maybe it will simply remind you that even an ordinary life can shine when it is lived with love. If you have watched this far, thank you for sharing this moment with me. If her story touched something in you, subscribe to the channel so we can keep telling stories that matter. And if you are still here, right now, listening to these final words, write the number 1 in the comments, because that number means you felt it too. It means you listened not just with your ears, but with your heart. And maybe somewhere deep inside, a part of you is still singing along, singing along, singing along, singing along.